Hey, thanks, man. Hey, good evening, everybody. Can everybody hear okay? I can't see you all that well. You hear all right? Anyway, thank you all for coming this evening. I feel like a bit of an anomaly, and I asked to go last for two reasons. One is that I knew everybody else would be incredibly prepared and really uplifting, and that I wouldn't be prepared. But the real reason is that, when I heard about the theme of the event, visions for the future, it kind of made me a little nervous because, truth be told, given the work that I do as an experimental social psychologist, I'm not sure the future is all that auspicious. But with that in mind, let me give it a try. Anyway, the British novelist Thomas Hardy wrote, "If a way to the better there be, it lies in taking a full look at the worst." And with that in mind, and not to bring you down after what was really a spectacularly fine evening, I believe that the future for humanity is frankly very bleak in light of a historically unprecedented confluence of four major problems that I think currently confront us. First and maybe foremost is war. Although we're not directly affected by it, I would argue that even the most benevolent glance at human history reveals an ongoing succession of genocidal atrocities punctuated by the brutal subjugation of designated in-house inferiors and the development of increasingly sophisticated weapons of mass destruction in the 20th century make it entirely possible that humans will be the first species to prune our own branch from the proverbial tree of life. I'm already miserable. Second, vodka. Environmental degradation. Only the willfully ignorant or intellectually dormant can deny that human-induced climate change has altered the Earth's environment to the point where it may no longer be fit for human habitation, although it will be a panacea for mosquitoes, jellyfish, and snakes. Third, and no, that wasn't a joke. I'll tell you when I'm trying. I'll tell you all when I'm trying to be funny. No, that wasn't. That was serious. All right. Third, and contributing to environmental degradation is our relentless and mindless pursuit of money and stuff. More people in the United States go shopping in the days after Thanksgiving than who vote in presidential elections. Greasing the wheels of commerce on the internet or staggering off the couch or after seeing who could drink the most yak urine on Survivor to incinerate the atmosphere, driving their gas-guzzling cars over to Walmart to save a dime on a lemon and a chainsaw. Finally, and fourth, America is a petri dish of psychopathology. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, 12% of the population of the United States is currently depressed. 1/3 of the adults in the United States will be depressed at some point in their lives. Another 10 to 20% of the population is addicted to drugs and alcohol. Too many of us, I would submit, are both comfortably or uncomfortably numb. All of these superficially disparate problems, war, environmental degradation, mindless consumption, psychological dis-ease, I would argue, based on my work, result in part from malignant manifestations of some very uniquely human existential concerns. All right, let's see how and why this is the case. Although humans share with all forms of life a biological predisposition towards self-preservation in the service of both survival and reproduction, we are quite unique in our capacity for sophisticated, abstract, and symbolic thought. In fact, this enables us to do some spectacular things, particularly to imagine things that do not yet exist, and then to have the audacity to transform our dreams into reality. When Leonardo da Vinci was scribbling pictures of airplanes and helicopters in his notebooks in the 15th century, people thought that he was crazy. And yet today it's remarkable that we are routinely transported by what was originally dismissed as the doodlings of a madman. And this sublime ability to transform the world in accordance with our desires clearly makes us the only truly creative species. And it's also, I believe, surely one of the primary reasons why we've been so fantastically successful as a species. Well, so what? These sophisticated cognitive capacities, in turn, render human beings aware of the fact that we exist, what psychologists these days call consciousness or self-awareness. And the point is actually quite simple. A rose bush exists, but doesn't necessarily know that it exists. And a turtle exists, but doesn't necessarily know that it exists. I'm not going to get into a protracted debate with you today about whether or not your dog knows that it exists. I would just argue that only human beings exist and know that we exist. And the point that existential philosophers make is that consciousness or self-awareness, to be alive and to know that we're alive, engenders two uniquely human emotions that are usually referred to as awe and dread, respectively. All right, the good news first before things take a decided turn south. It is literally awesome to be alive and to know it. And I know I can't see you, but either some head shakes or some hand wiggles. Who's ever gotten up one day and just felt that it's great to be alive? Anybody ever have that? I grew up in New Jersey, so it's been far and few between. But I vaguely remember that. But the point is, and I think it's an important one, is that some of our finest moments come from the sheer joy of luxuriating in the spontaneous exuberance of life itself. All right, but unless you're a child or an idiot, if you're alive and you know it, then you are shackled with the unwelcome realization that, like all living things, you are of finite duration, and therefore you will someday die. Moreover, unless you're a child or an idiot, this realization is joined with the concurrent recognition that your death can occur at any time for reasons that you could never anticipate or control, and that from a purely biological point of view, you're a breathing piece of defecating meat that's no more enduring or significant than a lizard or a potato. Again, I'm not being funny. So, if you were perpetually aware, I submit, of the realities of the human condition, I'm going to die. I could be disemboweled by a hungry lion or smote by a basketball-sized malignant tumor. I'm a breathing piece of defecating meat. I'm a cold cut with an attitude. I'm a talking sausage. I'm Spam with a plan, but I've got no can. All of these realizations would conspire, some say, to render our ancestors totally demoralized and paralyzed by overwhelming dread, had they not rather ingeniously managed the terror of death through the construction and maintenance of what anthropologists today call culture. All right, humanly constructed beliefs about reality that we share with people in groups to minimize anxiety by giving us a sense that we're persons of value in a world of meaning. And to accomplish this, what cultures do for us is every culture provides us with an account of the origin of the universe. And every culture has prescriptions of appropriate conduct, and all cultures offer some hope of immortality, either literally in the form of heavens, afterlives, and reincarnations of the world's great religions, or symbolically through having children, amassing great fortunes, producing great art, or scientific discoveries, such that while we may not be here forever, we are comforted by the possibility that a tangible manifestation of our existence will persist over time nonetheless. When we embrace cultural worldviews and glean self-esteem from perceiving that we're meeting or exceeding the standards of value associated with them, this keeps mortal terror at bay. And if we had more time, I would argue that some of our finest, most noble and enduring accomplishments are a result of this uniquely human yearning for immortality. On the other hand, however, it has also produced some unforeseen, unsavory, and potentially lethal complications. One difficulty arises when we run into people that do not share our beliefs about the nature of reality. And the problem here is to the extent that our own beliefs about reality serve a death-denying function, the mere existence of people with different beliefs is fundamentally threatening. Because if we admit of the legitimacy of an alternative conception of reality, we necessarily undermine the confidence with which we subscribe to our own views. And when we do that, we expose ourselves to the very anxiety that those beliefs were erected to mitigate in the first place. All right, so for example, if I believe that God created the earth in 6 days before taking a very well-deserved break, and then I run into somebody from the Borneo in the South Pacific who believed that the earth was created from a giant coconut that came out of the side of a palm tree, well, if they're right, then I must be wrong. And so the first line of psychological defense when we run into people who are different is to denigrate or disparage them. And so sure, the Borneo believed that the earth was created from a coconut. But then again, these are ignorant savages that wear grass skirts and live in tents and worship piles of sticks and mud. They don't have pants, well, neither do I for that matter, but they don't have pants or cell phones or Netflix. And if they did, they would surely see things our way. And at the same time that we disparage and belittle people who are different, we also try to convince them to dispose of their ideas and to adopt ours instead. I think Christian missionaries are probably the best example, but by no means the only example, trundling into indigenous communities that have been thriving for thousands of years, waving the sign of the cross and proclaiming, "You're all Catholic now, let's play bingo." And so, when we run into people that are different, we belittle them. We try to convert them to our way of life, or we just kill those inferior aliens and demonstrate the superiority of our beliefs. My God is better than your God, and we will kick your ass to prove it. Well, indeed, studies show that when people are reminded of their mortality, for example, by completing a death anxiety questionnaire, or being interviewed in front of a funeral parlor, or even exposed to the word death that's flashed so rapidly on a computer screen, 28 milliseconds, that you don't know that you've even seen anything. When people are reminded of their own death, Christians, for example, become more derogatory towards Jews, and Jews become more hostile towards Muslims. Germans sit further away from Turkish people. Americans reminded of death become more physically aggressive to other Americans that don't share their political beliefs. Iranians reminded of death are more supportive of suicide bombing, and they're more willing to consider becoming martyrs themselves. Americans reminded of their mortality become more enthusiastic about preemptive nuclear, chemical, and biological attacks against countries who pose no direct threat to us. So man's inhumanity to man, our hostility and disdain towards people who are different, results then, I would argue, at least in part, from our inability to tolerate others who do not share the beliefs that we rely on in order to shield ourselves from mortal terror. And summarizing this state of affairs, one of my favorite playwrights, George Bernard Shaw, observed that when the angel of death sounds his trumpet, the pretenses of civilization are blown from men's heads into the mud like hats in a gust of wind. Well, the uniquely human fear of death, rather, also contributes to environmental problems by fostering discomfort with nature. After all, everything in nature is of finite duration and will eventually decay and die. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, as they say. That's why our ancestors just said no to reality by constructing the supernatural universe where humans are immune to the vagaries of time and space. Remember, I'm sure you do, in the story of Genesis, how God created the heavens and earth and all of the plants and animals before creating Adam and Eve in his image and giving them dominion over the planet and all its inhabitants. But this arrogantly homocentric view of ourselves has had catastrophic effects on the natural environment, which we have plundered like giant inebriated gluttons, gorging ourselves at an all-you-can-eat buffet and pissing on the table on the way out for good measure. That was kind of a joke. Well, how do we know that this is true? Well, again, laboratory studies confirm that intimations of mortality increase our contempt for and disregard of nature. After thinking about their death, people deny that humans are animals. After thinking about their death, people have more negative attitudes towards animals and consider it more appropriate to kill animals for reasons other than food and medical research. Death reminders also make people more uncomfortable in natural settings as opposed to cultivated surroundings, and more willing to exploit natural resources such as forests for personal gain. And this same disinclination to die that fuels hatred of people who are different and stokes cavalier disregard for nature has also transformed us into mindless consumers with insatiable desires for money and stuff. Traditional economists assume that money was originally created and still serves only to facilitate the exchange of goods and services, and that consumer choices are driven solely by rational calculations. However, this uber-rational conception of money and consumption does not tell the whole story, because we know that since antiquity, money and stuff has served as psychological fetishes to ward off death anxiety. First of all, there's a strong positive correlation between death anxiety and materialism. That is, people with high death anxiety tend to be much more materialistic. Secondly, following death reminders, people have higher fiscal aspirations and say they intend to spend more on clothing and entertainment. Death reminders also make people yearn for high-status luxury goods like Lexuses and Rolexes. And after thinking about their own death, people asked to draw pictures of coins and dollar bills actually draw bigger images. Money literally looms larger when death is on our minds. And really interestingly, after just handing people some money and having them count it, people's death anxiety is reduced. I like how the playwright Tennessee Williams put it in one of my favorite plays, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, where he says, the human animal is a beast that dies, and if he has money, he buys and buys and buys, and I think the reason that he buys everything he can buy is that in the back of his mind, he has the crazy hope that one of his purchases will be life everlasting. Well, I think this helps explain why many people in the United States, or more people in the U.S., shop in the days after Thanksgiving than vote in presidential elections. All right, but what about epidemic levels of depression and other forms of psychopathology, including drug and alcohol abuse that currently exist in our culture? I'm convinced by psychologists who say that whenever people are pervasively unhappy in any given time and place, that we need to consider if the prevailing standards of value are attainable for the average individual in that culture. And so, for example, in the United States today, self-esteem for men is predicated on having an obscene amount of power and wealth. And we are taught from a very early age that if we work hard, we can be as wealthy and as powerful as Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, when in fact, as some of you all know, social mobility in the U.S. today is very, very limited. You are much more likely to get out of poverty in Bangladesh than you are in the United States. And so when many of us grow up wearing polyester suits, selling 3-pound burritos at the Taco Bell drive-thru, making minimum wage, we tend to blame ourselves accordingly. And self-esteem for women in the U.S. today, and in fact in all of the Western world, is predicated on being thinner than a piece of linguine, bosoms accepted, of course, and perpetually young. If I can't floss my teeth with you, ladies, you're too fat. And if you're older than 25 or 30 years old, you are a time-ridden hag. And the point that I would make is that teaching our children to strive for unattainable standards of meaning and value is a recipe for psychological despair. And research is quite clear. It demonstrates that low self-esteem is associated with a host of psychological complications and self-destructive behaviors. I don't feel too good. All right, anyway. So, I have presented what I believe is not a particularly flattering conception of our species, but I would argue that it's not unrealistic. And I advance this argument this evening because I sincerely believe with Thomas Hardy that if a way to the better there be, it lies in taking a full look at the worst. Malignant manifestations of death anxiety bring out the worst in us: depressed, demoralized, disillusioned, hateful warmongers who have transformed the planet into a toxic waste dump in our insatiable quest for dollars and dross, in a perpetual drug, alcohol, television, and Facebook-induced stupor. Well, in this sense, humanity, I would profess, is at a crossroads. And I think a case could be made that our future depends more than ever on what we do now. If we do nothing, we might have the ignominious distinction of being the first form of life to be directly responsible for our extinction. However, and I think this is the important point that hopefully renders me wrong about everything else that I have said so far this evening, we humans have a very good track record at solving seemingly intractable difficulties once we understand their underlying basis. For example, infectious diseases exterminated millions of people until we figured out that illness was caused by germs rather than evil spirits. This led to the discovery of antibiotics and the practice of modern medicine. Perhaps once we fully recognize the central role that mortal terror plays in human affairs, we can deploy our remarkable ingenuity to find ways of counteracting the destructive potential our fears can and often do unleash. Albert Camus, one of my favorite authors, wrote, "Come to terms with death. Thereafter, anything is possible." I sincerely hope that he was right. Thank you.